Secretary of Work began his second career as a strategist in the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Selected for President Obama's DoD transition team, he later served as Undersecretary of the Navy. And then after a brief stop as the CEO of the Center for New American Security, Secretary of Work succeeded Secretary Carter to become our 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense. He has a history of articulating the need to link strategy to technology, and just like General Horner, he likes short introductions. So, without further ado, Secretary of Work.
Well, it's great to be here tonight, see so many familiar faces, and to be in front of such an august group. I want to thank Dave for inviting me, extending me the invitation to come here to commemorate the 21st anniversary of Desert Storm. And as I was trying to think as a Marine what type of joke to tell an audience of primarily Air Force, I honestly couldn't come up with one that you would understand. Now you can take that any way you want, but I really want to thank all the veterans who are here tonight of that campaign. And I wanted to talk about Desert Storm, in my mind, as the first real manifestation of what Bill Perry and Paul Kaminsky called the second offset strategy. And I'll explain that in my speech. And I'll have some time for questions if you want to delve into it. Theorists of military revolutions would have it, Desert Storm was called the defining battle of the second offset strategy. Or as I like to call it, it was the big reveal. Desert Storm demonstrated how the awesome combat power of a joint, theater-wide battle network that employed precision-directed mass aerial fires, as well as precise guided munition fires, would change the conduct of conventional warfare in the 21st century. I want to just take a second to define what I consider to be a battle network. Is a combination of three vertically stacked and interconnected grids. There's a sensor grid that tries to understand what is happening in the environment, both in terms of enemy forces and blue forces. It tries to understand the impact of weather on potential operations. There's a sensor network that is providing commanders with a wide variety of inputs. Then there's a command control, communications, and intelligence grid, in which commanders process that information, decide what type of effects they want to achieve on the battlefield, and they give orders to do so. And then there is an effectors group. And the effectors might be kinetic strikes, they might be electronic warfare strikes, they might be cyber strikes, they might be information operations. But it is this stacked set of grids which comprises a battle network. Now, in my view, the first modern battle network was the British Integrated Air Defense System, developed by Air Marshal Dowding before and perfected during the Battle of Britain. It had a very capable sensor grid, probably the best of its time. It had radar, it had electronic warfare intercept capabilities, had spotters. It had a countrywide hardened C3I grid, which was totally interconnected, primarily by wire and telephone, with a central brain and fighter command connected through all of the sectors down to the individual airfield. And it had an effective and very deadly effector grid, comprising barrage balloons, anti-aircraft weapons, and very good air superiority fighters in the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Now, at the time, for us, this is kind of, sure, an integrated air defense network. But at the time, that was an astounding technological organizational construct, and it contributed in no small way to the defeat of the entire German air campaign. But the battle network effector grid was, by and large, dominated by weapons that employed unguided munitions. So as a result, that battle network really did nothing more than take surprise out of the engagements, allowing the British to mask their fighter planes against mass German bomber formations in which unguided machine guns were the arbiter of air combat. And it wasn't until the advent of guided weapons that the nature and character of battle networks began to change. This is important to me. A lot of people say it's all about the network, and you can have a network, and it provides enormous capability. But I would argue if you don't have the guided munitions as part of your effectors grid, you would not nearly have the impact that you would otherwise expect. Now, this is important, and I'm going to explain it in ways that I think about as a Marine Fire Support Officer, not necessarily the way you think about it. But up until Desert Storm, most campaign battle networks were defensive in nature. The British IAD system was copied by the Germans. The Navy had an integrated air defense system over their fleet. The United States conducted the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE network, which was an intercontinental defensive battle network in the 1950s and 60s. The U.S. Navy Cold War ASW battle network was primarily defensive in nature, although it had offensive capabilities, but it was designed primarily to prevent Soviet submarines from penetrating the GF Gap and disrupting the convoys that would be coming across the pond. Many of you here might have remembered and might have fought against North Vietnam IADS, which was among the most modern and deadly in the world at that time. So what made Desert Storm so remarkable from a historical perspective, in my view, was that it was by design the first campaign-level offensive battle network that was demonstrated in warfare, incorporating precisely directed, unguided fires against mass formations and guided munition attacks at precise targets throughout the breadth and depth of the enemy's battle space. So how did we get there? Well, World War II saw unguided munitions warfare on a global scale. And the key characteristic of unguided weapons warfare is very simple. Most weapons that are fired, dropped, or launched miss their targets, and this distance increases rapidly over range. In 1944, the CEP of bombs dropped by the 8th Air Force was about 3,500 feet. So 50% of all bombs would fall within a circle that had a diameter of almost 1.5 miles. So understandably then, unguided munitions warfare had an inherent bias towards mass. Now during World War II, two alternatives were suggested themselves. The first came in the form of atomic weapons, which tried to take CEP out of the equation. Close enough for government work. And the second came in the form of guided munitions, which tried to drive the CEP down to zero. And the antecedents of every single guided munition that we have today, with the exception of the GPS guided munitions, were seen in World War II. In 1945, an S-band live weapon called the BAT was launched by a Navy patrol aircraft and hit a Japanese destroyer 20 nautical miles away. Now, in the early Cold War period, we enjoyed nuclear superiority, so the U.S. opted to concentrate on atomic warheads for both strategic and conventional deterrence. The first offset strategy relied upon battlefield nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet Union from launching a ground invasion of Western Europe. And they provided a ready alternative to unguided munitions warfare, massed artillery, massed close air support, dropping unguided bombs. And it was, in the president's mind, President Eisenhower, a ruthlessly efficient way to the operational challenge by the Soviet Union's massive conventional superiority. Now, the threat of raining numerous nuclear weapons down upon the inter-German border didn't really excite the Germans or our NATO allies. But it seemed to have been effective in having conventional deterrence through the 60s and the 70s. But thinking about how to best bolster conventional deterrence began to change in Vietnam, as advances in electro-optical and laser-guided weapons offered a glimpse of what was possible with guided munitions warfare, which promised accuracy independent of range. And I would say that 1972 was the inflection point. In that year, U.S. Air Force and Navy aviators primarily dropped over 10,000 guided munitions in that single year. And it gave the first true glimpse of air-delivered guided munitions fire at the operational campaign level. Now, soon thereafter, the Yom Kippur War came. SAM-6 surprised the Israelis, and so the lethality of defensive air battle networks, IADs, were becoming even more problematic. And then the Sagger-guided missiles were very good in defensive battle networks on the ground. Now, it's very interesting, and I'm sorry, Barry Watts, I heard he was injured, but Barry and I spent 2 years debating why didn't this period spark an enormous change in the Air Force and the Navy and the way they went about things. Why didn't we start thinking in terms of offensive battle networks? Well, I'll get to that in just a second, but the thing that really sparked it was the United States came out of Vietnam, and they looked at the Soviet Union, and they had achieved nuclear parity with the United States, so the threat of using battlefield nuclear weapons simply wasn't credible anymore. And they had a massive conventional buildup, postured in a way to make it difficult for NATO to employ nuclear weapons even if they wanted to, because they were stacked in successive echelons designed to create a penetration for an operational maneuver group that would go deep inside NATO's defenses, and you wouldn't be able to employ nukes in that regard. So the NATO's first response, or the Army's, the US Army's first response to this was called active defense. And what it was is all of the units on the fly, the forward line of troops, or the FEBA, the forward edge of the battle area, would discern where the penetration was coming, and they would stack up right in front of it. And it was supposed to be a short-range guided munitions battle, primarily using air-launched missiles like the TOW from helicopters, the Copperhead, all sorts of different ground laser-guided stuff, and then the Air Force providing close air support right upon the fly. No one liked this. I mean, the Army, every Army officer said this is ridiculous. You've ceded the initiative to the enemy, you're giving up territory, and all of the analysis run by Dave's predecessors at RAND said you will run out of guided munitions before you stop the penetration, and you will lose the war. So in 1975, the Long Range Research and Development Planning Program carefully studied the use of guided munitions in Vietnam and Yom Kippur, and they concluded that as a matter of policy, the United States should start to pursue guided munitions, what they called at the time conventional weapons with near zero miss. And they were talking about CEP. Now, very quickly, the DSB did a study in 1976 that proposed a deep strike system made up of high-resolution synthetic aperture radar, target fusion center, and long-range missiles that employed tank-killing submunitions. And they recommended that these technologies be combined, tested, and demonstrated. Harold Brown and William Perry at the time said, "You're exactly right, but we don't trust the services to do it. There are too many equities involved." So they gave it to DARPA. That was an extremely important decision. That started in 1977 and culminated in a demonstration in 1981. It was called Assault Breaker. Congress at the time, we look back and we say, hey, we're so great. But at the time, Congress didn't think this was going to work, and they withheld money from DARPA. They said, this Assault Breaker idea is just stupid. And so DARPA used money it already had to go forward. Now, the Assault Breaker demonstration combined what was then called the PAVE Mover targeting radar, a ground-based data processing station, and the submunition dispensing missiles, the attackers. And key to the overall was an attack coordination center, a brain for the battle network for sensor fusion and being able to decide what effects you wanted to achieve at what range using what weapons. And the final Assault Breaker test in 1981, we actually cheated on it. We actually made it look better because we knew the Soviets were looking very carefully at it. But we did have 5 direct hits on 5 stationary tanks. And we said, hallelujah! You know, back then that was serious business. The tanks just being stationary and be able to hit them, targeting from over the horizon. And DARPA did all that for $200 million. Now, the impact of this demonstration really didn't have all that big of an impact on the United States. It had some, but the Soviets got it automatically. As Norman Friedman wrote, Assault Breaker was a disaster for the Soviets, who now, quote, believed that their American rivals were scientific magicians, that they said they could do whatever they said they could do, they could do. But it would take more of a demonstration to really change the course of defense thinking Because in essence, what DARPA said is, look, you can build an operational campaign-level battle network, a defensive battle network that employs guided munitions in the conduct of a combined arms defense. But it would take the services to apply its lessons. All the technological sauce, we can talk all day. It's up to the services to decide how it will be impactful on the battlefield. And while some in the US military established questions assault breakers, it's hard for us to believe now that people would say, are you kidding? You wouldn't want precision? A lot of people didn't think it would work. But there were several visionaries in the Army and the Air Force, Don Starry and Bill Creech, among many others. And they took the technological sauce of assault breaker and they cooked up a whole new technological operational construct known as air-land battle, which NATO later adopted as follow-on forces attack. Now, in the end, assault breaker, the demonstration didn't remain as a single integrated system, more as the pity. Its parts were fielded as the JSTARS in the Air Force, the Army's ATACMS missile, and various tank-killing submunitions. But air-land battle became the doctrine of US forces in Europe, and FOFA became the operational concept for NATO. And as it turned out, the implications of assault breaker, air-land battle, and FOFA were quickly discerned by the Soviets. And in 1984, they gave it a name. They said, we are headed towards reconnaissance strike complexes. And the head of the General Staff, Marshal Argarkov, famously said, these complexes would make possible to achieve destructive effects on Soviet tactical formations equivalent to low-yield tactical nuclear weapons. That was the second offset. Now, there's other aspects of the second offset. A lot of people think stealth was very important, and it truly was. But we kept stealth under wraps until 1989. The only thing that was visible to the Soviets was the defensive campaign battle network. So I would argue that it was this defensive battle network employing guided munitions fire that was key to the second offset strategy. And we know from the historical record, without question, that the mere articulation of the strategy injected great uncertainty in the minds of the Soviet General Staff. It compelled them to change their entire warfighting planning, and the offset strategy made their old operating models obsolete, and the prospect for making the investments to make new operation models was well beyond what they were capable of doing with their economy at the time. So unquestionably, it strengthened NATO and US conventional deterrence and contributed in no small way to the end of the Cold War. So let's fast forward to 1990. That's when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait and take on the United States. Now, of all the times in the history of warfare that somebody said, I want to go to war against the biggest nation on the planet, it was not the time to do it. The all-out volunteer force had fully matured. Many of you in this audience probably remember the early years of the all-volunteer force between 1975 and 80. I certainly do. And it was pretty bad. But by 1990, 15, 18 years into all-volunteer force, we had superb people from our leaders all the way down to our airmen and our privates. We had shrugged off the debilitating effects that Vietnam had on our conscript force. And then the post-Vietnam recapitalization of all of our battlefield and air platforms was well underway, and they were well maintained. We actually had open money at the time. Along with the doctrinal revolution that I just talked about, there was a revolution underway in training. Motivated by the results of Vietnam, the Air Force took to heart the lessons of the Navy's Top Gun School. Pilot proficiency was important as the new weapons, and they drove up kill ratios and began aggressor programs in the Red Flag in 1975. The Army starts the National Command Training Center at Fort Irwin. And in 1986, Goldwater-Nichols strengthened the ability of the combatant commander to achieve unified action of the armed forces in the theater of operations. Now, all these human capital, doctrinal, tactical, and training advances were in full stride when Saddam Hussein made the ill-advised decision to invade Kuwait. So I feel quite confident. Although I was here, I was actually in headquarters of the Marine Corps at the time, and we were expecting up to 10,000 casualties. It was supposed to be a bloodbath. But no matter how we would look back, I think the results might have differed along the way, but we would have defeated them. We would have beaten them like a red-headed stepchild. But in hindsight, We sometimes forget that our development of a campaign-level offensive battle network employing guided munitions was not a sure thing. There were significant cultural impediments throughout the 1980s. Perry had to take stealth away from the Air Force and personally take control because those in the Air Force didn't think stealth would work, and they thought it was taking money away from the 15, the 16, and the A-10. The Air Force was reluctant to fully embrace guided munitions because mainly they were laser-guided weapons and electro-optical weapons, and in Europe, along the front, 9 months out of the year, you have clouds. So are you really going to go all in? The Navy saw it as a purely economic decision. Their airplanes didn't have the bring-back weight to land on the carrier with unexpended ordnance. So they looked at it and said, am I going to take up a $3 million missile and then drop it into the ocean so I can get back aboard the boat if I can't find a target? So they didn't go all in either. So as a result, the Army and the Air Force community generally went into Desert Storm with the smart plane dumb bomb model of Vietnam. The President in the Black Hole, Clemenceau, working for General Horner, Dave Neptula was there, John Gordon back in the Air Staff, and the Checkmate planners, they conceived of an entirely different way to go about these things. They flipped the defensive battle network on its head and said, we can employ this at the campaign level across the depth and breadth of a battlefield. They connected the awesome capabilities of our national space constellation, which was designed to support strategic warfighters up to and through a nuclear exchange. But they connected those sensors into the sensor grid of the battle network. They brought JSTARS forward, even though it was in a developmental phase. They brought as many sensors forward as they could. And although they didn't call it at the time, they didn't call it a KAOC at the time, I would say that the KAOC was the most important operational construct of the second offset because it became the central brain of a battle network that was designed to employ offensive fires throughout. They reconfigured the GPS constellation to synchronize the entire battle network in time and space, which is the thing you need to have for a campaign-level battle network. If you don't have that, it really becomes difficult to control. They integrated stealth into the campaign and used the first GPS-guided munitions to pry apart the IAD systems the Iraqi had and deliver pinpoint strikes against strategic targets. And I would argue, whether they intended or not, they had a very clever strategic information campaign, because I think you all know that the number of precision-guided weapons that we dropped was only about 4% of all the weapons employed. But it looked on the TV like we were pounding the shit out of them with guided munitions. And what that told people was, who really understood what was happening, if we can accomplish this with 4% of total weapons employed being guided, imagine what would happen if 100% of the weapons were guided. Now, we weren't perfect. The Navy couldn't plug into the ATO. We had all sorts of command and control, C3I grid problems. It was kind of a kludge network that General Horner and General Schwarzkopf and all of the commanders kind of put together. It worked, wasn't perfect. And we could do more with our space, but it was pretty freaking awesome. And I'll leave it to the historians to decide whether it was a revolution in war or not. But what we know is this: the nature of war does not change, but its character is constantly changing. As Barry Watts says, changes over time in underlying technology, weapons, tactics, and methods, operational concepts, organizational arrangements, and military doctrine have produced dramatic changes in war's actual practice. And without a doubt, from the black hole cell to the innovative thinkers in Checkmate, a collection of Americans, a relatively small one when we look back in the historical record, completely shifted the paradigm of a second offset strategy that was defensive in nature to theater-wide battle networks that were inherently offensive in nature. So all one has to do is look over the last 25 years and see what those small group of Americans did. From Desert Storm, you can draw a line to Bosnia. From Bosnia to Allied force over Yugoslavia and Kosovo, to the initial campaign over, prior to Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and the initial conventional campaign in Iraq, and today over Iraq and Syria, to see what the impact of just a few visionary folks that said, yeah, we created this for defense, but let's do it for offense. And oh, it's a pretty cool thing if you do that. And we accrue the strategic benefits over the last 25 years of being a first mover in this regime. The Soviets understood it, but they couldn't make it, and no one could match our scale, and we've had tremendous advantages because of it for the last 25 years. Just like what happened in the 1970s, we had a first offset strategy that worked pretty good for 20 years, and the Soviets achieved strategic nuclear parity. So we had to have a new offset. Now, what we worry about is our advanced competitors like Russia and China having guided munitions parity with us now too. And their battle networks are as capable, their sensor grids are getting better every day. They are able to throw guided munitions denser and farther, as dense and as far as we can, and it creates the so-called A2AD problem. So we need a new offset strategy. So we don't care whether we're fighting for 1,000 nautical miles or 100 nautical miles. We're going to have to grapple with this problem. Now, the way I challenge the Army is this. I say, tell me how far down you think precision munitions will go by 2030. I know right now we have guided 20 millimeter rounds. We will soon have guided 50 caliber rounds. And the technical community believes we will have laser beam riding 7.62 rounds by 2030. So what does that do for infantry tactics? It does something. I don't know what it is. You better tell me what the air-land battle looks like when you're under attack from guided munitions from the time you hit the battlefield with rockets, precision-guided air strikes, and then precision-guided direct fire weapons. That's why we think it's time for us to pursue a third offset strategy. I can get into it if you want to have questions, I can do it. I didn't really want to talk too long because I know I've already talked too long. But the premise is this. These collisions of battle networks be battle networks. If we are smart and use advances in artificial intelligence and autonomy, it will allow the joint force multi-dimensional battle networks to come to a new level of collaborative human-machine battle networks. And we believe that that will provide us with potentially as big of a warfighting advantage as the second offset did in 1990. Now, when we talk about autonomy, all we do is autonomy is nothing more than delegating decision-making authority within the battle network. And you can delegate to a machine or you can delegate to a person. But those decisions are very, very important. And it's up for the Air Force to figure out how far down into what they want to delegate. It's up to the Army to do the same thing on their local battle networks. But all of these things will make our battle networks far more powerful. And we know there's going to be 5 things we need to look at. First are deep learning machines. It's just amazing what's happening. I don't know if you saw it, but about 10 days ago, Google, their AI for the first time defeated a Go Grandmaster. It was the last game that computers had not defeated the humans. It has over 250 million move combinations. And it was considered to be almost impossible for a machine to get to that creative space. But about 10 days ago, Google, which was in a race with Facebook AI, was able to create the AI team to do that. So we can talk about learning machines. Then there's human-machine collaboration, combined intelligence, using machines to make human decisions faster, better, and the effects that they are looking for more effective. The F-35 is not a fighter plane. It is a BN-35, a Battle Network 35. It is a sensor computer node in a distributed campaign-level battle network that causes the decisions of the pilot to be so much better than the adversary, and also provides enormous benefit to the battle network by sucking up this information and passing it on. There's assisted human operations, wearable electronics, heads-up displays, combat apps, all of those things that are plugged into the network to allow every human to be part of this collaborative human-machine battle network. Human-machine combat teaming, enough said for this audience. and then networked, autonomous, network-enabled, cyber-hardened weapons. Those 5 things, if we can convince the 4 services that that is the general direction we need to go, the general direction, like in 1975, look, all stop. You should go after as a series of national policy guided munitions with near zero miss. What we're saying is we believe that the 4 services should look at these 5 different technological pieces, decide how they fit in with their battle networks, and develop the organizational and operational constructs to make it real and have battlefield effect. Now, I think the people in here really get this because you live this. You understood that it wasn't so much the technology, it was the people thinking it through and how you put it together. You leveraged the technological edge, to be sure, but you had to go much further. You organize yourself differently. We didn't call it the chaos, but we had a chaos. You trained differently, and you even thought differently, sometimes going against established doctrines and its guardians, wherever they may be found. There's a lot of them. And you tried something new. So it took human creativity to do this. So what we want to do is be able to give all of the people thinking about the 3rd offset the same opportunity. So I want to salute every veteran of Desert Storm in this group tonight. You demonstrated the breathtaking power of a truly joint force. Not without its words, but it was a joint force. With outstanding people, creative doctrine, unmatched training, cutting-edge, well-maintained equipment. And this combined force, using a theater-wide battle network, demonstrated the ability to put pressure on an adversary across the entire depth and breadth and at a tempo that induced our enemy to a level of uncertainty and paralysis that was ultimately the reason why we only had a 100-hour ground war. So I especially want to salute those who thought of how you would make this second offset real and to create an operational level offensive battle network that employed guided munitions throughout the battlefield. It paved the way for maneuver and finished the enemy whenever or wherever they tried to hide. I hope you're an inspiration to a new group of leaders who now have to do the same thing you did in a new